Hello and welcome to the Flower of Light Mystery School podcast number 2. And joining me today is Christine.
Good morning.
And Charlotte, our techie and our editor.
Hello.
So in the last podcast we talked about, we talked about many things, but one of the things I wanted to expand on in this podcast today is the book of Coming Forth by Light, or the book of Becoming Light. So basically the book of Coming Forth by Light is, as I mentioned before, written on all the walls of the sacred sites in the form of symbols and pictograms. So the basic structure of the book of Coming Forth by Light, which is also known as the Book of the Dead, is it is for the soul who has just recently deceased and who's making their journey in what was known as the duat. And they have to make 12 steps, or there's 12 processes, or in the book it's written as 12 hours. So it's the 12 hours of night in the underworld that the soul has to take in order to reach its goal, which is the duat. So this structure of the 12 around one, the soul that's making the journey, and the 12 hours of the night through which it needs to pass, mirrors the sun moving through the 12 constellations of the zodiac and the precessional cycle. Now, the Book of Coming Forth by Light, of course, was renamed by, I think it was Wallace Budge. I know it was translated by other people as well, but it was renamed as the Book of the Dead.
Yeah.
That's what it's referred to now. But it was also rewritten at the Council of Nicaea.
Really?
When the Bible was compiled, if you like. And so many things from the Book of Coming Forth by Light, or other names for it is the Book of Coming Forth by Day. And as I mentioned, the book itself in its original form is actually the instructions of how the soul passes consciously through death.
Right. So it's kind of like remembering kind of a thing, consciously.
A conscious death is ascension.
Yeah, okay.
An unconscious death is death. There is no death.
Yes.
There is no such thing as death. And this is what this information, if you like, is telling us, but in the language I mentioned of symbols, pictograms, which we mentioned in the first broadcast, which broadcasts or communicates, transmits the information to the subconscious mind.
Yeah, which is always on, as we said
Which
before.
is always on, always receiving information. So it is really, and the closest thing I would say would explain what it actually is in words, is the Book of Becoming Light.
Yes, that makes so much sense, yeah.
But in a sense, we're not actually becoming light, we already are light.
It's the remembering part.
It's the remembering.
Yeah.
So the goal, as I mentioned, of the recently deceased is to make its way through the 12 hours of night, as is told in the Book of the Dead, or the Book of Coming Forth by Light. You can see the difference in the names, the Book of the Dead.
Yes.
So, I mean, to rename a book that's actually talking about conscious ascension.
Yeah. And label it with that, like, death
Yeah,
thing, so people
label
would
it
not
with-
go here and be afraid of it.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Book of the Dead.
So it's a kind of a trick.
And so, yeah, and you know, in the ancient world as well, you know, in ancient Egypt at the time of the Amun priesthood, it began to be sold to people.
Yeah, I know that. I've seen that in museums.
Yeah, so that was never the case.
Like buying indulgences in the Roman Catholic Church, the same sort of a thing.
Yeah, but I mean, that was never the status quo.
Right.
When it was in its original form and being used by the original consciousness, if you like,
Yeah.
that were using it on Earth. It was for everybody who understood it and who sought it out. It was never kept secret. It was always sacred, but never kept secret. And so it was always there for anybody who sought it out. But it did begin as corruption moved on in time. It did begin to be sold literally to the highest bidder.
Right.
But again, as I said, moving more into the future, it was renamed the Book of the Dead and the Bible. So, really, for a story that's telling you how to become light, you can see how just a simple renaming something.
Oh, can put you down the wrong path, a dead end.
Now, the reason
Pardon the pun.
the reason I'm elaborating on the renaming thing is because we're going to discuss the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
Not in too much detail in this, because I will do it expand on the Tower of Babel in a different podcast, but I do touch upon it in this. And the reason I'm elaborating on the idea of the change of name is because that's what the Tower of Babel story is. It's how our language, how we understand communication. Because communication is not just through spoken language. A communication can be given in the form that the Book of Coming Forth by Light is, through symbols and pictograms, visually. But it's also broadcast in a frequency as well.
And that would be like the equivalent of telepathy. If your auric field, you're picking up the frequency.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This Book of Coming Forth by Light, Becoming Light, is also the book of the earth, the book of creation. Because although I'm talking on this aspect of how it's describing to the soul how it moves out of the body after death and how it successfully moves through these 12 phases and on into the duat, which is the land of the eternal or the immortal. Although it's describing that, it's also describing the other way around, which is really the same process.
Like descending into matter.
Exactly. So it describes the descension of consciousness or energy into matter and the ascension of that consciousness out of matter.
It's kind of a cycle.
It is, exactly. And it's about remembering. It's about remembering.
Yeah, it's all about the conscious memory.
Yeah, because we know this. It's not, we don't have to become anything or really do anything. We're already everything.
Yeah, we are born with all the information. It's whether we connect to it or awaken it.
Exactly. So the Tower of Babel is how our language, how our spoken language, and how we actually communicate with each other was distorted. And that's what's told in that story. So, for example, if we look at the Great Pyramid in Egypt, we spoke in the last podcast about how all the sites holographically encode all the information.
Yeah, exactly.
In this book. And it's not a book, as we mentioned. It's written on all the walls of the sacred sites all around the world. And not just on the walls. It's written mathematically, geometrically, in the standard unit of measurement that's used in the construction of the sacred site. And it's also coded in the sense of the line of longitude and latitude on which the sacred site is placed.
Yeah, so it's where it's on the earth is important as well.
Exactly. It's where it's on the earth. So, if you take the earth, for example, as, I know it's not a perfect sphere, but if we take it as roughly a circle, I know there's other ideas about the shape of the earth, but I'm not going to go into that. So, if we take it as, and because it's not a perfect sphere, it bulges at the equator and is slightly flattened at the poles, so it's more of a kind of an ovoid shape. So there is a longest line of latitude, which is the 0 degree meridian line.
Yeah.
And that line dissects the earth in a perfect half. It covers the most amount of landmass on the earth. And the line that runs in along the equator, but not the equator, but the lines that run around the earth. The longest line that covers the most amount of landmass. Where both of those lines cross is where the Great Pyramid is placed on the earth. So in other words, the Great Pyramid is placed at the exact centre
of the landmass of the earth.
So the Great Pyramid itself is, as we mentioned, placed at the centre of the landmass of the earth, but it's also, its core structure is of granite. And granite is 99% quartz crystal, which makes the Great Pyramid effectively a crystal. And when you look at how it's placed at the centre of the earth and how all the other ancient sites around the world are placed and encode their location in terms of lines of longitude and latitude away from the Great Pyramid. What you see when you look at that is that it's a network. It's an actual network of sites, ancient sites on the ground. It's not haphazard.
Oh, no, not at all. No.
It's a design. It's a plan. It's intentional. Thanks, Charlotte. It's intentional. And so what would that be? So it tells us that in order to be what's known as an AKH effective, AKH, AKH effective spirit, and Anak is in ancient Egypt, there was different names for different parts of the composite being that we call a human being. There was different names. So there was the Ka, there was the Ba, there was the Ak. So the Ak, the Ka, is most closely resembles your ego or the personality that you take on in any incarnation.
Yeah, so it's who you are today. So
Yeah.
it's Christine.
Yeah, it's who you are,
But not my soul.
in whatever reality you think you're in. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Ba is the soul, the eternal part. The Ak, AKH. The Ak was one who had gone through all these phases of becoming light, of remembering that it is light, and therefore remembering that it is eternal, and therefore remembering that it is the creator consciousness of its own experience and universe. And when one had become and reached that level of enlightenment through the mystery schools, one of the powers, if you want to say, or abilities or skills or whatever way you want to name it, that you would have is that you can consciously and at will incarnate into the third dimension in order to help, if you like, in order to help humanity. Because that is
So that would be like present day people think of as an ascended master.
yes.
He can basically come down with his expertise and help people fix a problem or raise a consciousness or awaken people.
Yeah. Once a person has gone through this process of ascension, really is what we're talking about.
Right.
And once they have done that and gone through a conscious death, therefore knowing that they are eternal, immortal, ageless, timeless, and the creator of their own universe and experience. And once the consciousness or the soul has reached that level of enlightenment, the only thing it can do is to teach others the same thing.
That's it.
And effectively, you're not really ever teaching anybody. All anybody is ever doing is triggering memory.
Exactly. And
There are no teachers and students. Every single person is a teacher and a student and a master all rolled into one.
Yeah.
Because all we're ever really doing is triggering each other's memories.
It's funny because the word you're using is trigger, which means a different connotation today. And I think that's really true. Like triggering people, it's the concept of dissonance, right? Where they get triggered and they get angry. But
Right,
that's because they have possibly an internalized identity for themselves, and you're challenging them to drop their ego in a way, their ka.
Well, yeah, I mean, going through this process really is dropping what we consider to be the ego, because in reality, all these things, including our ego, are all illusory.
Right, exactly, yes.
It's the illusion that we've created for ourselves, because ultimately, and I always think it's quite amusing, because in order for us to get to the simplicity of what this actually tells us,
Yeah.
we've got to go through all these complications. We've got to go through the drama of it all. We've got to go through the complication of it all to see the pure simplicity. But if somebody gives you the pure simplicity first, you won't accept it.
That's exactly right.
Because it's too simple. You've got to actually go through all the complications. And when I can define the complications by saying the way we come into this reality, the way we grow up as adults and we become involved in the drama of our own illusion. And so that's what I mean by complications, because that's what we do. We become involved in the drama of our own creation. Because once we realize this information, what we realize is that we are eternal, we are ageless, and we are the creator of our own universe. I'm not the creator of your universe. I'm not the creator of Charlotte's universe.
Yeah, exactly.
Nor is she the creator of mine, nor are you, Christine, the creator of mine. And in that way, we're all creators.
Yeah.
We all create our own universe and our own reality using the only substance there is to create with, and that is thought. Thoughts, ideas, consciousness.
Thoth.
Yeah. But you've got to go through the complication to get to the simplicity. And ultimately, what you find is that even though we're all creators of our own universe and own reality, when you move even into the higher realms or deeper, whatever way you want to look at it, all those universes and creators of different realities ultimately are all one. It's all one conscious.
A singular consciousness.
Intelligent, loving energy. Yeah. Source energy.
Oh my God.
Source energy, exactly. And the power of that energy is love.
Absolutely. It's the
Pure,
it transcends
unconditional
everything. But that's the thing.
love.
Pure,
Unconditional
That's the
love.
hard part. The
Yeah.
unconditional love is challenging because of what you just said.
It's challenging because of the illusion of the ego that we've
Yes.
created for
Yeah.
ourselves. And it's always the ego. It's always the ego that will say, I'm never going to forgive you. I'm going to hate you forever and hold this grudge forever and ever and ever. But when the ego is moved out of the way, it's only the ego that ever says things like that. Once the ego is out of the way, forgiveness
Well,
will
in a way-
always be there.
It's like a self-defense of the ego for itself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You know, it's defending that you're going to change what it knows to be, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's good that we're bringing it into the whole idea of the ego and things like that as well, because I'm often asked when I'm doing the journeys and the workshops and things like that, how does this actually relate to my everyday life,
Yeah.
this information? So once we get the ego out of the way, deconstruct the ego, what this information does, it basically breaks down everything that you thought was your reality. So once you get the ego out of the way, it leaves you open, if you like, for want of better words, to be able to receive this higher communication, this higher dimensional information. So, again, as I mentioned, in order to be effective in this 3D reality, in this time-space matrix that we've created for ourselves, in order to be an effective spirit, as we mentioned, you have to have gone through all these phases and steps so that you become a being who has consciously gone through death and therefore remembered your immortality, remembered that you are the creator. And this is what the mystery schools was about. And this information would have been given to people, as I mentioned, not ever secret, but as they sought it out themselves. And if we can be that being where the ego doesn't get in the way in this life, then we can communicate with the higher self and make decisions based on information from our own higher selves, so that we have more knowledge, more wisdom to make decisions that are going to affect us further down the line. And that's only really on a very small level of how this would really help your everyday life, if you like. So an effective spirit was also somebody that created a sacred site. So I just want to bring it around to Akhenaten, because there's a whole thing about how Akhenaten was and I know at first when you hear this it sounds quite maybe even shocking in a way that the character that was referred to in the Bible as Moses was actually Akhenaten. But when you kind of look into it a bit more and realize that it was only during the 18th dynasty that the name of Moses or Tutmosis was ever used. And Akhenaten himself, which is probably not most common knowledge, changed his name when he was in exile from Egypt to Moses. So why is this why is this?
Question, Antoinette, was Moses a title or a name?
Moses was a title.
Okay.
And it was a title that denoted somebody who had lost the right to use their royal name or their given name. And so they would use the name Moses, which meant the heir to something, the son and heir.
Yes.
So the name Thothmos or Tutmos meant the heir to the wisdom of Thoth.
Right.
Or the son and heir to the wisdom of Thoth.
The S-O-N, not the S-U-N. Or both.
Both, actually. S-U-N. It would be more related to the sun, the S-U-N.
Yeah.
Because that's a good point, actually, because this information, and, I didn't say it because I think it's probably fairly obvious, but then everything should be mentioned.
Yeah.
Is, and always was, as freely available for females as it is for males. It was never...
I was just going to say Mary.
So when we say sun, we were talking about S-U-N.
Yes.
Not the sun, not S-sun.
Yes.
So Akhenaten, as I mentioned in the first podcast, was was the lineage, the link to the lineage that connects Ireland. So it's Akhenaten that wrote the Old Testament, or the books of the Pentateuch, the book of Moses,
right?
The Old Testament, the book of Genesis. So.
Oh, and what does Genesis mean as well?
Well, Genesis is a compilation of two words, of course. It's genes and Isis, so it's the genes of Isis. Genesis is also referring to the genes of Isis, which is another
podcast.
Another podcast, yeah. So, as I mentioned, this ancient information, which called the Book of Becoming Light, which is not actually a book at all. It's just referred to as a book, and is written in all the ancient sites all around the world. In symbol form, and in how they're actually placed on the earth, and how their unit of measurement is used, because it all uses the sacred blueprint of creation. And when you link up all those ancient sites with the Great Pyramid as the master crystal at the center.
Right, so the plug basically to activate it all.
What you find is that the sites on the earth create a crystal grid.
Yes.
And that crystal grid broadcasts an energy which is mirrored above the earth. So effectively, the sites broadcast and create the crystalline energy grid.
Yeah, like the frequency of the planet.
Exactly, it's a higher crystalline energy grid.
Yeah.
That some would refer to it as Christ consciousness grid.
Yeah, and because everything is consciousness, so the planet is conscious as well. You can't think of it in a 3D way that it's just a planet. It's actually its own energy grid you're talking about. It's how the people on the earth are as above, so below. The tiny little bits standing on the earth are standing on a planet that's also a conscious being, which has its own energy field. And that's how it's all combines, because you're crystalline as well. There's crystals in your bones, in your skeleton.
Exactly, we're crystal, yeah.
Life has to come from life, right?
Yes.
We're crystal, yeah. So... And again, a good point about the human, because this information is literally written in the DNA. And when I say it's the book of the earth, the book of life, the book of creation, it is all those things. It's the book of becoming light. It's the book, I suppose, in a way, of dead as well. Yeah. The book of the dead as well. Because it is about all those things. And it is literally written in your DNA. It's the book of nature. You see it in how plants grow.
Yes. The Fibonacci sequence.
The Fibonacci sequence, which approximates the phi spiral.
Yes.
And so, as I said, this information was rewritten in more recent times at the Council of Nicaea and became the Bible.
I have a question, Antoinette. My question is, the Ak person or consciousness. So you mentioned that they are the ones that are motivated to build the sacred sites.
Yeah, it's... the goal of the creation of all the sacred sites was to build the Duat on earth. The Duat was the land of the immortal, where people never grew old, where people never got sick, where people had no problems, where they were always happy. And I suppose you could compare it to, well, actually, no, I don't suppose. It is exactly the same as Tir na Nog.
Yes, that's the Irish,
Irish
label for it.
The Irish land. Tir na Nog is the land of the young, or the land of Og is young.
Yes.
Means young in Irish. And Tir is land. So Tir na Nog is the land of the eternal young, or the always young.
Yeah,
Those
the one
were always
thing,
young.
just to diverge for 1 second, the one thing that I always thought was fascinating is in a lot of the Irish mythology, which is mostly oral, when a person was living in Tir na Nog, if they came back to Ireland and set their foot on the land,
That's right.
they instantly aged.
That's right. That's the story of Uiscin.
Yes.
When he, through one story or another, he ended up living in Tir na Nog, but he lived there for 300 years. But to him, it felt like 3 weeks. But when he came back to the three-dimensional, let's say, land of Ireland, and he basically get down off his horse. He was on a horse that brought
That's
him
right.
out from Tir na Nog. And when he got down off the horse and touched the actual physical 3D land, he aged every year of the 300 years within a minute.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a parable. It's
That's it. Yes.
the moral of the story that once you descend back into the 3D, that's when time starts again.
The clock begins
Because
to tick.
time does not exist. Time is
Yes.
an illusion. Time is a construct of the mind.
Yes. Yeah.
Time is man-made, as we have created God in the image of the human being, not the other way. The human being has created God in their image, not the other way around.
Yes.
I mean, we're told that we're created in the image of God, but actually we have created God in our image, because we've created God as this man who sits in the clouds for Christians, Catholics. And I know, growing up as an Irish student in school, that was the image that you had in your mind of an angry God sitting on a cloud,
Yeah. To be judged.
just looking down on
But
you.
to be
know?
judged sounds so much just like it's your ego. Absolutely.
to be judged
Right?
or punished or whatever. So, as I mentioned, this book of Coming Forth by Light, which was, and you mentioned how the ancient Irish information was always transmitted orally. Well, it's the same with the information in the mystery schools. It wasn't written down in the sense of any language that we know. It was always transmitted orally. And the closest that we can get to having this information written down is, as I have mentioned, the symbols and the pictograms on the wall, and the mathematical language that's used in the construction of the sites. That's the closest, and that it is the language.
Yeah.
That is the language. And it is the blueprint describing how everything becomes matter, from pure consciousness to matter, and back again. That cycle.
It is the whole holographic reality.
Exactly. And so Akhenaten, as I mentioned, the story of Moses, and the burning bush, and receiving the 10 Commandments, that whole story is really a more modern retelling of how, and the story of how Akhenaten discovered the emerald tablets of Thoth. And that's the whole discovery of the emerald tablets of Thoth by Akhenaten is linked in with, of course, his change of his name. And he changed his name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten. And Ach, AKH being at the beginning of his name, Akhenaten, will show you that he was an Ach, effective spirit. So that being at the beginning of his name, the Ach at the beginning of his name, is telling us that he was an ascended master. Now I know there's different opinions of people on Akhenaten, but Akhenaten is one of the most misunderstood characters.
But that's on purpose.
For
They did a
example,
hatchet job on him.
well, exactly. All his images have been chiseled out from all the temples all over Egypt. They literally tried to delete his memory, if you like.
Yes.
Tel El Amarna and the city of Akhenaten was destroyed. There's nothing of it left, But anyway, so Akhenaten was also the one who wrote the hymn to the Aten. Now this is actually quite poignant that that we're talking about this now, because I don't know, Christine, or Charlotte, if you've heard, but just recently the Pope changed the words.
What? No, I did not hear
You
that.
didn't. So just recently, the Pope changed the words of the prayer, Our Father who art in heaven.
Oh my God.
And the words are changed from where it mentions, lead us not into temptation. Well, the Pope changed those words to, let us not fall into temptation. Now, that's a whole conversation in itself about what that actually means. But what I'm saying is, it is Akhenaten who wrote the hymn to the Aten. And it's the hymn to the Aten that was dissected at the Council of Nicaea and reformulated in what we know today as the Our Father who art in heaven. So I know that the Christian world many people are quite unhappy about the idea of the Pope changing the Our Father, because I've heard people saying that this is the Lord's Prayer and it's never been changed. Well, I'm sorry, it has.
Of course.
Akhenaten wrote it. It was called the Hymn to the Aten.
Yes, I've
And
read
if you want to actually know the real Our Father, if you read the Hymn to the Aten, that is what the original thing is, written by Akhenaten. It was also Akhenaten who is the first person in recorded history to say, I am the Son of God, meaning S-U-N,
Yes.
not S-O-N.
Yes.
I am the Son of God. And so those things together will tell you that he was an ascended master. And it was Akhenaten, of course, who in his time, who re-established the mystery schools and who took many people through the process of ascension and through the process of that ascension, which is in the land of Egypt, moving through all the ancient sites, as we spoke about in the first podcast, all the ancient sites mirroring the chakras in the human body. And so the concept of as above, so below, which states that everything is according to the blueprint of creation on larger and smaller scales. So if we're moving through the sites which represent our chakras in the third dimension on Earth, then we can know that in the higher dimensions that's also taking place. So in our consciousness, as well as our physical movement, when we move through all the temples on our path of our mystery school journey, the equal thing is happening in our consciousness, in the energy realms, in the realms of spirit consciousness. The same thing is happening. We are moving from one level of consciousness to the next, which is what your chakras represent. Your chakras are like a filter through which your consciousness perceives the world.
Yeah, it's a spiraling energy vortex within your physical body.
Exactly. And if you're very much in your base chakra, then your consciousness is very much centered on, how do I make money? How do I survive? How do I keep my physical body alive? How do I feed myself? As you move up into the more higher chakras and the more subtle energy, then the thoughts become higher and more subtle. And your thoughts, as you move into the heart energy, become more about love, forgiveness, kindness, unity.
Yeah, and the heart chakra is also, for me, that is the entry point for where your energy comes into your body, correct?
The heart is where the magnetic field
originates from.
The energy field that is magnetic, that surrounds. We have an electromagnetic field that surrounds us. The magnetic part of that field comes from the heart. The electrical part of that field is generated by the brain. The brain is electrical in nature. Yes. The heart is magnetic and creates the magnetic field, and together they create the electromagnetic field. And the part of the spectrum of the electromagnetic field that we see is what we call light, because we have infrared and X-rays and so on that we can't see.
Yeah, well, there's so much we can't see. Our eyes are very limited.
Well, we can only see 4%.
Yeah.
4% of the visible universe.
4%.
Of the visible universe, but the visible universe, it's only 4%. The other 96% is what they call dark energy or dark matter.
Well, what is that really? That's just a
honest,
label.
The 4% and the 96% kind of almost represents our conscious mind and that which we call our ego or our self.
Yeah, how I
That's
Yeah,
almost
like-
Perceive
like
it, right?
that's only 4% of who we really are.
That's it.
The other 96% is represented by the dark energy and the dark matter,
And
which represents our.
It seems to
subconscious.
me, when you think about bringing it back to the beginning, when you think about the Book of Coming Forth for Light, aka three-dimensionally known as the Book of the Dead. So if you have people calling the 96% of what you really are dark matter, because they don't want you to know
Exactly.
that you're light,
Dark matter or dark
right?
energy,
So
yeah.
that it goes along with it being called the Book of the Dead. Like,
Well, exactly. And there we go. That's the whole thing about the Tower of Babel. It's how they changed
Yes.
the words, the language. The language was changed so that we no longer understand this information. Because Babel now means babble. Babble.
yeah, babbling,
Which means
babbling
babbling,
idiot.
not making sense.
Yeah.
But the word Babel is actually made up of two words. And the first word is Bab, which means gate. And the second word is El, which is the singular form for the word God. The plural is Elohim in the Hebrew. El is God, Elohim is gods. So Babel actually means gate to God. So when we hear of the story, for example, of the building of the Tower of Babel and the confusion of the language, of the original universal language before the tower, when we think about that, we can understand that if it was a gate to God, as opposed to what we've been told, like a tower, you know, that's kind of two different.
Yeah.
You know, if you think of like a gate to God, that it brings up all sorts of different connotations. If you think of a tower,
A
you know,
doorway.
a tower, because I don't think many people know that Bab El actually means gate to God.
Well, if you think of a tower, right, you have to ascend
Exactly.
to the top.
Yeah.
So it's like what you're doing
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
in a mystery school.
And the Tower of Babel was also known as the Migdal Tower. In relation to Migdal, like Magdalene, Mary Migdal.
That's what I was going to ask you about, because I know Moses' title. I know Mary, and the ocean is called Mary in French. Women are
Mare,
called Mary.
yeah.
So it
Mara
was
is
also
the
a
sea.
title in ancient Egypt for the female initiate.
Mary was not a name, exactly. That's a very good point. Thanks, Christine. So Mary, M-E-R-I, was not a name. It was a title. And a Mary was, as you mentioned, a female effective
Yeah.
consciousness. But female in the 3D form, if you like. So they would have been known as Marys. So the story of Akhenaten discovering the emerald tablets of Thoth is really the same story as told in the Bible,
Yes.
as Moses discovering the
Burning bush.
and God talking to him and giving him the 10 Commandments. Now the interesting thing is, just to give you the link, a bit of a link in there, that in the Book of Coming Forth by Light, or the Book of Becoming Light, there's an area in it where it's in the area where the weighing of the heart, and that's probably the most famous scene from the Book of the Dead, or the Book of Coming Forth by Light, that most people would know, and that is the weighing of the heart. Now, if you if you remember earlier, we said the heart generates the magnetic field, the brain generates the electrical field. So the heart was being weighed against the balance of a feather. This is in the 5th hour of our journey. Remember I said in the
Right.
beginning that the journey of the soul after death, it has to take 12 steps or 12 processes it has to go through. Or in the book it says 12 hours of night, the 12 hours of the night.
Yeah.
So the journey of the soul through the 12 hours of night.
And the sun as well.
Through the dark to get to the light, right?
Exactly. Coming forth by light, coming forth by day. So in the 5th hour is where the soul, where the heart is being weighed against the balance of the feather. And if the heart is not as light as a feather, then the soul is consumed by a composite being called Amit. If the heart is lighter than the feather, or as light as a feather, it can proceed into the 6th and the 7th and the 8th hour and on into the duat and the realm of immortality of the gods. So this is the information that was freely available to everybody until we had, for example, I mentioned the Council of Nicaea and the Ammon priesthood, who rearranged it all. And in that scene where the weighing of the heart takes place, there's also a time where the soul, or the initiate if you like, has to recite what's known as the 42 negative confessions.
That's right.
And the 42 negative confessions are, for example, I have not lied, I have not cheated, I have not stolen, I have not coveted my neighbour's goods. And I'm not quoting word for word, they're just loose examples of the 42 negative confessions. But just to make the link that those 42 negative confessions actually are what became the 10 Commandments. And the 2 tablets that Moses comes down the mountain with and breaks. You know, when we consider the story of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, and how the knowledge and the science and the wisdom of the ancient Atlanteans was inscribed in these characters that nobody understood on 2 pillars.
That's right. Green pillars, right?
That's the story that we're told. I think 1 pillar was made of gold and 1 pillar was made of stone. And both pillars were engraved with all the science of the ancient Atlanteans, their advanced knowledge and science, which, by the way, is what we would call quantum physics. I mean, all the advancements that we have today in quantum physics, in robotics, in AI, in all those areas, and any other area you can think of, is nothing compared to the knowledge and the information that these people had. Why? Because they worked and understood the natural earth energy. They worked in harmony
with nature,
with the universal laws. And the universal laws describe the process of energy and the working of the intelligent energy. And when you work in harmony with that, then you have access to the power of creation.
Yeah.
But when you work in disharmony with it or against it, then that's when destruction happens. And so the whole story of Akhenaten, the whole story of him leading his people out of Egypt, that's the story we're told in the Bible, that Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt. And the same story of Akhenaten leading his people to build a new city and a new temple in the direct geodetic centre of Ireland, which was at of Egypt, which was the direct centre of Egypt was at Tel El Amarna. And so...
Yeah, actually, because a lot of people, archaeologists say, Tel Amarna, Akhenaten, he picked it because of the valley and where the sun would come over it. But what you're saying is it would be part of it, but mostly it was because of its physical
the direct
location.
centre of Egypt.
Yeah.
And it was a place where nobody had...
No, it was free. It was
built
clean. It was
anything on before. And if you consider what I mentioned earlier as the Great Pyramid being the direct centre of the Earth's landmass,
yes,
while Akhenaten built his city and temple in the direct centre of Egypt. And I'd like to mention just at that point that we have a site in Ireland called Uocoming,
I was just going to say the same thing.
where we have a stone called the Cat Stone. And that's also marks the Cat Stone is also called the Navel Stone, which marks the centre of Ireland. So we can see how this blueprint and the people building these ancient sites knew the same information. So I'm saying that the people who would have constructed all the ancient sites all around the world, but from my point of view in Ireland and in Egypt, were the same consciousness who understood and who are using the same knowledge and the same...
Yeah, for me, I think all of that was a
blueprint.
worldwide consciousness.
Yeah.
I don't think it was in any geographic location.
No,
it was everywhere.
It was worldwide, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I personally am connecting Ireland and Egypt because I'm Irish and I moved to Egypt and to establish my centre, and that is because of a motorbike accident I had when I was 14 and a death experience that I had, but I will talk about that in other podcasts. And so Akhenaten, as I mentioned, wrote what we would call the Torah. And the word Torah is the same as the word Taurus and Tara. So we can see there straight away a link with the language. And again, the language and the words are always important. So Tara and Taurus are the same. The geometric construction of a torus is what is actually written in the first line of the book of Genesis holographically. Now I know that's
Well, describe that.
rather
to me, like,
large
put a
piece
picture
of
in my head.
information I just said there. So the first line of the Hebrew Torah, the first line of the Hebrew Torah is written. And there's 27 letters in the first line. The 28th being being a replica of the first.
It starts like an octave. It starts again. It's the same.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, if you were to write, like in Hebrew, it can be. No, I don't know Hebrew.
Right.
I haven't studied Hebrew, but I know that they don't have like full stops and kind of commas and that type of thing. So
Their
it's like
punctuation
almost
is
it's
different.
like one long sentence.
Oh, it sounds like mine kind of literature.
It's like it's just like one long sentence if you like. And there's a man called Stan Tenen, and he runs a place.
A wonderful person, Stan Tenen.
Yeah, an amazing guy, and he runs a place called the Meru Foundation. And if you Google him, you'll find his incredible information. And what he realized was that through pattern recognition, that he actually went through a process. Again, have a look at his videos. I'm just going to briefly tell you. He went through a process of writing all 28 letters out on a string of beads. And when you spiral the beads around on each other and match the letters up with their counterpart letters, and come to where the last 28th letter matches up with the first letter. Now, okay, I know, but you watch the videos. What you actually create is a vortex, is a tube torus or a donut torus.
Yeah.
That's what you create.
And that's a human being's energy field.
And Stan Tenen realized that if you trace the path of the 7-rayed spectrum, if you just take one color, one ray, and you trace that colored ray through a torus, and somehow make a model of it, which is what he did. So the pathway of one ray through a tube torus. And when he took that model out, what he saw was that it was a replica of the human hand.
Wow.
But what he also realized was that if you were to shine a light behind this model and have a whiteboard in front of you and turn and move it as the shadow has been cast, the model actually creates the letters in which the first line of the book of the Torah is written.
Wow.
So, in other words, the first line of the Torah, through its letters, creates the geometric shape. The geometric shape gives you the model that, when turned at certain angles, gives you the letters.
So as above, so below again.
So it's
the frequency of it.
Yeah, so it's like the hologram in each
exactly
little section of a thing. The
exactly
whole thing remains.
Yeah.
Right.
So the first line of the book of Genesis actually is, information-wise speaking, the same as the Great Pyramid.
Wow.
It encodes
the same information.
Exactly the same information.
In a different frequency, but the same frequency in terms of the information.
Exactly. And geometrically.
Yeah.
Geometrically.
Which means it goes and communicates directly to your subconscious mind, which is your connection to your higher self. No language needed. Language is for the 3D.
Exactly. It's a different type of... I say language because we can all relate to what language means.
Yeah, because...
That's why I use the word language.
Because of the Tower of Babel, we're no more telepathic in terms of we haven't embraced our telepathy. Right?
So this is not even... It is telepathic, you're right to say that, yeah. Mm-hmm. But it's also in our DNA. When
yes.
when you think of a telepathic communication, you think of a mind-to-mind transference of information.
It's genetic as well, like in terms of the sunlight.
But this is actually written in the DNA. It's written... It's how everything grows. It's the information by which...
Unity of everyone.
Exactly. It's the information by which every plant on Earth grows. Every animal grows. Every
the
insect,
light
every
is the
human
information.
being.
The light is the information.
The light is the information.
Yeah.
So when the light... That's how important sunlight is to a human being.
Absolutely.
You should be out in the sun because it's the information.
And that brings us back to why the soul is making the journey into the light,
Yeah.
into the information. into the information. So
Remembering it.
You're remembering.
Remembering,
It's the
yeah.
trigger, right? It's one of the
that's
triggers, sunlight.
exactly good, Charlotte. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we're all rubbing sun cream all over ourselves.
To disconnect the information flow.
Well, anyway, that's
That's
different.
another podcast.
That's a different.
Another podcast.
Another. So, so really, I just want to talk about then, of course, Akhenaten and the exile. As I mentioned, the exile of the people out of Egypt. So, where did they go? And what did they take with them? So, when you look, and I'll speak about this in another podcast as well. But when you look at the people who left Egypt in that exile, that would have been at the time of Akhenaten. There was more than one exile out of Egypt of people. There was more than one, or exodus if you want to call it that. There was more than one. But so on one of those occasions, what we find is the daughter. Akhenaten had a lot of daughters. They say 6, but there possibly was a lot more. So one of his daughters was Meriaten.
Oh, Mary.
So we mentioned what Mary is.
M-E-R-I?
Mary is a title of
A high initiate.
of a female who has gone through the mystery schools exactly and become an affective spirit or a master, and who has consciously incarnated
Yes.
in this dimension to assist those who actually don't have the information, if you like. So, and the whole idea of when all those people, this is the interesting point as well, when all the exodus of the people of Akhenaten, when they left Egypt, that's when the Egyptian civilization fell into total decline. It's like somebody pulled the plug and Egypt lost its power and its
Consciousness, really.
ability, and that is what happened. Now, I know there are some people who put Akhenaten on
Oh, they say he's crazy.
the scale of being crazy, of being a heretic, and also people who say that Akhenaten is in the lineage of those who would be the Cabal today, and there are people who would consider that Akhenaten would have been a very negative being. That's not my experience.
Or nor mine either.
It's not my experience. And my experience of Akhenaten and my knowing what he is as I'm saying here now. So, his daughter Meriaten, who also they say her body is found in Egypt. Her body was buried in Egypt. I know that they do say that, but they also say they have the body of Akhenaten, which is
I
not
don't
true
think they
either.
have the
Which is
body
not true either. And in actual fact, the character known as Tutankhamun, who, they say is the son of Akhenaten. Well, that's not been 100% established whether he is the son of Akhenaten or not. There is a kind of an interesting side note by which he may have been the brother of Akhenaten, Thutmose, placed in the tomb. Because Thutmose, the brother of Akhenaten, just disappears.
That's
at
true,
one point
actually. Yeah, that's right.
in history. So,
And there's severe damage to the mummy that they say is, Tutankhamun, it was burned. Remember, the whole thing was burned through whatever happened in the process of mummification. So, I mean, there is a lot of room for, you don't know.
Well, I just mentioned that, because Egyptologists do say that they have the body of Meriaten, but I know different because Meriaten is buried in County Kerry in Ireland.
Tralee. Outside of Tralee.
In Tralee. And she's buried in a place known as Glen Scota because she was known by the name Scota, and Scota land is still named after her today. And in fact, Ireland was named after her. Ireland was known as Scota Moor, which is Big Scota, and Scotland was known as Scota Beag, which means small Scota. So Ireland was actually named after her, and Scotland still is till this day. But she's in Glen Scota, or also this means the Vale of the Little Flower.
Yes,
or the
a
Valley
beautiful
of the
place.
Little Flower.
Beautiful little valley. For myself, having been there, a sliver of land between two running streams, so the energy is phenomenal.
Amazing.
Because
and
of the running water.
And a stone circle
Yes,
marks
her resting place.
her resting place. So just to connect it to the Irish, in the Book of Ballymote, which is one of the ancient manuscripts of Ireland, and again I know a lot of the things in ancient Ireland, like in ancient Egypt, were manipulated. So we have to kind of look through
like
a lot of things.
The annals of the Four Masters,
yeah,
who are actually commissioned
there's truth
by the
and
church.
There's distortion.
It's disinformation.
It's the same
across
as the
the ages. Yeah.
Yeah. There's truth and distortion in all of the books, really. But if you look, you will find the what you need as well. So we're told in the Book of Ballymote that it was 72 chieftains that went to the building of the Tower of Babel.
Mm-hmm.
And remember that the Babel is the gate to God. So
they're not telling you where it was. It could be anywhere. Physically.
Well, yeah, they're not, but
was it in the Giza Plateau?
I'm saying that the Tower of Babel is the Great Pyramid.
Yeah, I agree completely, yes.
I'm also saying that the Noah's Ark is the Great Pyramid. And I'm also saying that the Ark of the Covenant was in the Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it was necessarily a box or anything else, like, a golden box. But if you look at the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant, it's actually describing a golden rectangle, which is again bringing us back to the geometry and the blueprint. So it may well have been a physical thing.
It may have become a physical thing. Because, when your consciousness falls, right, they were going to do the best they can, right?
Yeah,
like monatomic gold to continue if they didn't have the physical capabilities of doing it anymore, like consciousness-wise.
Yeah, it may have become a physical thing at one point, but... So the Tower of Babel, Noah's Ark, and the Ark of the Covenant all refer to the pyramids.
Yes.
And, to the Giza Plateau and the three pyramids and the Sphinx there, and all of the other structures that are there as well. But the Tower of Babel in particular referring to the Great Pyramid. And so we're told that the 72 chieftains go to the building of the Tower of Babel. And the story of Godael Glass, or Gaithalos, he's known as. And Gaithalos was the grandson of Nell. Is it Nell? And Nell was... They say that the Tower of Babel was on the plain of Shinar.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And so the idea behind the building of the Tower of Babel was that, we're told in the Bible that the people of the earth had come together in one objective, with one goal, speaking one language, to build a tower that would reach to God. Hence it's known as Babel, to build a tower that would reach to God. And so we're told in the Bible that the gods looked down on the people and said, the gods held council and said that we better go down and destroy these people's language, destroy the tower, and
how dare they come up here with us?
Scatter them to the four corners of the earth and confuse their language so that they can never come together in cooperation again to build a tower. So that's what they did. Gods descended, they confused the language of the people, they broke the tower, deactivated the tower, if you want, and scattered the people to the four corners of the earth, giving them different languages so that they could never understand each other's speech.
Yeah, they could no longer unify themselves.
And so we see then, if we skip over to the Irish book, as I mentioned, the Book of Ballymote, it tells us how the Gaelic language, or the Irish language, was brought from the Tower of Babel. And it tells us the Irish language was created by combining the 72 languages of all the confused languages and the original language. By combining all those languages was how Imberla and the Gaelic language was created. And so I mentioned Meriatin, who became known as Scota, and Gaithalos, who was also known as Godael Glass. And Godael and Scota, it says, brought the Gaelic language by that method, as I just mentioned, into Ireland, and it became known as Gaelic. But the idea that while they were in the wilderness, that Gaithalos, or Godael, was bitten on the arm by a snake or a serpent. This is what we're told in the Bible. And Godael called on the magic healing power of Moses, aka Akhenaten, and asked him to heal the wound, because otherwise he would have died, of course. But and so Akhenaten healed the wound, or Moses, as it says in the Bible, healed the wound of Gaithalos. But where the bite happened, his arm went green. And it's Akhenaten says, or Moses in the Bible says, that in the land that you will go to, in the promised land that you will go to, there will never be any serpents or snakes in this land. But your arm will remain green to remind you. So Ireland is known as the Emerald Isle, of course, because of its green. But, you know, it's also, if we think of the Emerald Isle and the Emerald Tablets of Thoth,
Exactly.
that's another indication of,
Clue.
you know, how this all kind of connects up. So, as I mentioned, we have Scota, and she is buried along, there's a little river that runs just in front of her, and it's called the Finglas River. But the interesting thing about that is, we're told that Scota had many sons, and one of her sons was called Fionn Bawn, which means Fionn the White, but another one of her sons was known as Fionn Glass, which means Fionn the Green. Godale Glass means green in Gaelic. So Fionn Glass meant Fionn the Green. And for those of you out there that might be happy to hear that Finglas has a bit of a different and more
Profound.
textured meaning.
Profound connotation.
It doesn't actually mean clear stream, which is what you'll find if you Google what the word Finglas means. It means Fionn Glass, who is the son of Scota Meriatin. And the river that runs in front of the stone circle under which she rests is called the Finglas Rivulet, which I find very interesting, Fionn Glass. It's said that she was jumping that river while she was pregnant. She was on a horse, and the horse stumbled on the other side and she fell, and apparently that's how she died, but she's buried exactly where she died. And so that brings us to all the sites in Ireland. Now, the idea is, like, which came first, you know, but all the ancient sites in Ireland, like Newgrange, and any Irish person that you speak to will say, yo, you know, Newgrange is older than
The pyramids.
the pyramids, you know. So why was Scota, the daughter of Akhenaten, coming to Ireland? She was coming back to the land of her ancestors, and they were bringing back the
That
knowledge,
information, yeah.
this information, this knowledge, which is encoded in all, of course, the sites around Ireland. And so all the sites, basically, you know, that we look at, they're circles, stone circles, like, as I mentioned in the other podcast, all the sites in Ireland are kind of circles, mounds. All in Egypt are kind of rectangular, angular, tetrahedral pyramid shapes, representing male and female energy. So the Great Pyramid at the centre of the earth is not actually a tetrahedron, as we all thought,
Believe it
or
is.
may have thought. It's an octahedron, meaning that it's got 8 faces rather than 4.
Yeah.
And if we look at example, Newgrange. Newgrange is divided in the Wheel of 8, as we say, marking the solstices, the equinoxes, and the cross quarter days. So Akhenaten discovering the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, we're told that Thoth was the one who held the blueprint of creation. He was the one who set all the planets in motion, who balanced everything, who had the measure of everything, and he was known as Metatron. And Metatron is where the word matter,
Yes.
mother, comes from. And so, again, in the name Metatron, we can, even in that name is holographically encoded the information that we're talking about. So, just to mention, in Egypt as well, in the tomb of Thutmose III, who was the great-great-grandfather of Akhenaten, in that tomb you have the most complete scene of the book of the Duat, and that means the book of what is in the Duat.
It's beautiful. I've been into it.
It's beautiful, yeah. It's
The
really
hieroglyphs are just gorgeous.
Yeah, it's a beautiful tomb, but I think the most interesting thing is that it has the entire of the 12 hours of
Exactly.
and the
complete
entirety
information.
of the instructions, and the sarcophagus inside, of course, is amazing as well.
It's beautiful.
So again, all the sites around the earth, and with the pyramid, the crystal pyramid at the center, the Great Pyramid being an octahedron, and connected to all the ancient sites around the world, is what is creating the crystalline energy grid. And each site is placed on a vortex energy point on that grid and broadcasts the crystal energy. But that field, that whole energy field, is operates as a morphogenetic field. And any information that's placed into that field is communicated and disseminated to every being that is connected to that field.
It's very interesting. That's something to me that people don't really understand how instantaneous it is when you're in wherever you are on the earth. If you're in that energy,
It's instantaneous.
it's like a
communication.
complete activation.
Yeah.
And it's up to you to unpack the suitcase and get the information. Whether
Exactly.
your antenna, your physical body is, like you can.
Decode it.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for.
Einstein
Decode,
called it spooky action at a distance
That's
because
right.
it exists outside of 3D time and
That's
space.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why birds
So
move,
it's
they do, and
communication
fishes
without
do.
any delay.
Yes.
In the third dimension, there's a delay in communication between the receiver and the transmitter. In this
With this information.
in this
and-
system, there is no. It's instantaneous.
No, it's exactly.
communication. And the interesting thing as well is that within this field of energy, the morphogenetic net or field of energy, the crystal grid, not everybody needs to know everything of this information within that energy field. And that brings us to the 144,000. The Great Pyramid.
Yeah, I was just going to say what you mean by that, but yes, now I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, the Great Pyramid was encased with 144,000 highly polished limestone casing stones.
Beautiful. I can only imagine.
Which shone like the sun. They were concave, an octahedron. Each face was concave in the center. So it
like little
literally
dishes.
would have been seen for miles around, reflecting the sunlight.
And with its gold pyramidion.
And if you look at a prism and how a prism shining through, light shining through a prism, first of all, it slows light down and it breaks it down into the 7 rays. So
we
if
can
you
see
consider
it.
yourself as light,
Yeah.
consider yourself passing through the shape of an octahedron, and your one light being broken down into the 7 rays that we now call our 7 chakras. You know, the cover,
That's
of,
exactly
the cover of the Pink Floyd album.
That's it, exactly.
So you are the one ray coming through, and then when you're broken down into the 7 rays on the other side, that's you in the 3D.
That's it.
And that's your 7 chakras that you have to climb back up again, which is the stairway to heaven.
That's it.
To
Stairway to
pass
heaven.
through the pyramid
Yep.
or the prism
The prism.
to become
the
the one
pyramidion.
light.
Yep. Out you go.
to become the one light again.
And it's your consciousness.
So the cover of Pink Floyd, my friends, have a look.
They're disseminating some information to you if you're awake.
Okay, so actually, you know what? I think that's probably a good place to end this podcast for today. So any questions that you might have, I would welcome any questions. But I would ask you can email them to me. I've disabled comments because I find that, there's plenty of people that have very interesting comments and very interesting questions. But we all know there's also other people out there who like to, do all sorts of things on somebody else's page, which I'm not going to make available for other people. But for anybody who wants to ask any questions, I more than welcome your questions. But I would ask that you email me to info@floweroflight.com, and in the subject bar, if you just put podcast questions, what I'll do is I'll read those questions and we will take a podcast where we answer everybody's question.
That's a great idea, yeah.
Okay. So for today, I'd just like to say thank you for listening to this second podcast from the Flower of Light. I'd also like to thank Christine.
Thank you very much, Antoinette. My pleasure.
And I'd like to thank Charlotte, who is been very quiet today, but Charlotte is in the background here doing all the techie stuff,
wizard stuff.
doing the techie stuff. So without Charlotte, none of this could happen.
Yeah.
So thanks very much, Charlotte. Thanks very much, Charlotte. And goodbye. And I'd just like to say again, love and light from the Flower of Light Mystery School.
And from the beautiful Boyne Valley.
Bye.
Bye.